Welcome to The Colporteur. My name is Caleb Cangelosi. The Colporteur is a production of Log College Press. Now, what is a colporteur, you might ask? Well, in the 19th century, primarily, a colporteur was a traveling book distributor and salesman across America. And that's essentially what Log College Press is in the 21st century. We exist to collect and to reprint the writings of and about the 18th and 19th century American Presbyterians. We believe that the past is not dead. The primary sources are not inaccessible, and American Presbyterians are not irrelevant. And so on our website, you can find approximately 5,300 free PDFs from over 800 American Presbyterian authors, as well as the 11 titles that we have published. And so we do encourage you to go and visit www.logcollegepress.com. So here on the Colporteur, we have started doing some video conversations with historians and scholars talking about American Presbyterians and their writings. And today, we have the great privilege of having with us Dr. John Fesko, who is a recent professor at RTS in Jackson. So I've had the privilege of getting to know John a little better as I am also here in the Jackson, Mississippi area. John, welcome to the Colporteur. Thanks for joining us today.
It's great to be here with you, Caleb.
Well, we are doing this by Zoom, obviously, from our homes and our offices. And we are excited today to talk about a very little known figure in American Presbyterian history, Henry Boynton Smith, as well as an article that he wrote that you can find on our website on the Henry Boynton Smith page on the Log College Press website, an article entitled "The Idea of Christian Theology as a System." It was an inaugural address that he delivered on the occasion of his induction to the chair of Systematic Theology in the Union Theological Seminary in New York in 1855. And so we're going to talk about the article. But before we do that, why don't you share with our listeners, our viewers, a little bit about yourself, John, and about how you came in to be interested in Henry Boynton Smith and some of the writing that maybe you're doing on him or on the 19th century American Presbyterians in general. Let's start there. Tell us about yourself and your journey academically.
You know, I started off being raised in a Christian home. I was baptized in the PCUS before the split because I was born in 1970. Not counting the OPC split back in the earlier part of the 20th century, since I am an OPC minister. And so grew up in a Christian home. Long story short, ended up being, sensing a call to ministry, and ended up going to seminary at Southwestern Baptist in Fort Worth, Texas. And while I was there, I listened to R.C. Sproul tapes, probably 3 to 4 hours a night while I was cleaning the library as a janitor. And the stories I could tell about cleaning the library. But we'll leave those for another day. And I finally figured out, I think I'm more Presbyterian than I am, Baptist. And so ended up going into the OPC, seeking ordination. But at the same time, while I was doing that, I was finishing up my doctoral work at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And so finished up that and then went to be a pastor, a church planter in Northwest Atlanta with the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And so I was a church planter and pastor for almost 11 years. And then I went and served as the academic dean at Westminster Seminary, California. And then this past year, ended up moving to the Jackson area in Jackson, Mississippi to be professor of systematic and historical theology. And so we've almost been in Jackson for about a year. I think it's right around 11 months, I think, going on here. So this is coming up on our 1-year anniversary. And of course, none of us expected the academic year to end up the way that it has. But, here we are. And so how I got interested in Smith was that I was doing research for a book. It originally began as, The Spirit of the Age. And I don't remember the subtitle. It's a really long Puritan subtitle.
The 19th century debate over the Holy Spirit and the Westminster Confession.
Yes, that's right. So I was doing research for that. And it actually just started off as just one essay. And I became so fascinated in the criticisms against the Westminster Confession that originated in the late 19th century that it kind of expanded into a little book. And that's where I first kind of came upon Smith. And I guess it's that work that got me, got some folks interested in asking me to write a small little biographical and theological essay on Smith for a forthcoming dictionary of apologists and their critics. And so I, worked on that. So I've got that. And so I found Smith to be a very interesting theologian because I think it's like a lot of people don't realize how philosophically interested, I think we could say that, philosophically interested 19th century Presbyterians were. I think that a lot of the Princetonians get a lot of attention for their so-called rationalism and the Scottish common sense realism. I'm not persuaded of that particular narrative, but they weren't the only ones that had philosophical interests. I think a lot of 19th century Presbyterians were very interested in the latest so-called philosophical developments coming out of the Enlightenment and wanting to use them as helpful insights and tools in the construction of their theology. And of course, depending upon who we're talking about, sometimes there's going to be more philosophy than theology, or sometimes the philosophy is just going to be a tool, something to help them kind of clarify things and to explain things. And so, so anyway, I think, at least in the big picture, Henry Boynton Smith is a very interesting Presbyterian theologian in that respect.
So one of the things I noticed in doing a little reading about him is that, like Hodge, he spent time in Germany, and so he grew up a Congregationalist, I think, and then spent time in Germany. And so even in this article that we're going to discuss, he's clearly conversant with German theology, German philosophy. What else can you tell us? Because he is little known. I guess all I knew about him before you and I started talking about doing this conversation was, Henry Boynton Smith, he's a New Schooler, like Charles Briggs. And so I didn't really know very much about him. So tell us kind of about his life and his ministry. Why do people need to know about him?
Yeah, he was, as many New Schoolers often were, that he was a Northerner, living up in the New England area. He was born in 1815, and he entered college at the age of 15, so perhaps a bit more, advanced than your average student. As you mentioned, he went to Bangor Theological Seminary. One of the things that I found interesting about him is I'd done some research on him, and I want to say I'm no expert on Smith. All I can say is let me share what I've encountered through my research, is that he suffered a lot physically with a lot of health ailments throughout his life, sometimes often sidelining him from teaching, and from when he returned from Germany from his advanced graduate studies in Germany. He was not really able to get a pulpit for about maybe close to 2 years. And part of that reason was because he had these physical ailments. And in the biographical work that I've done, I've not found out necessarily what those ailments were. But I always tell my students, it's important to get as full a picture of the person as we can, so that we recognize that a man is more than his writings. And if we recognize that he suffered significant, physical ailments throughout his life, that might give us a greater degree of sympathy for the man and a greater degree of understanding as to who he was, so that he's just more than the essays and the books and what have you that he's written. He did study in Germany. This was a very popular thing to do in the late 18th and the late 19th and early 20th century. You had Charles Briggs who did this, Henry Boynton Smith, Gerhardus Voss did this, J. Gresham Machen did this, Hodge did this, so this was a very popular thing to do. And it was there in Germany that he went to both the University of Halle as well as the University of Berlin. And it's there where he encountered August Tollock. And Tollock was going to be a major influence on his life. This was also an influence on Hodge's life. So there's some overlap there. But Tollock became a good personal friend of his. And then also Johann August Wilhelm Neander, the German church historian, was also another influence upon him at the University of Berlin. And it's there in Germany where he's going to pick up a number of his, I think, philosophical influences, because at this particular point in theological history or in church history, Hegel, idealism, and Kant are huge influences in the German theological scene. And so you get a lot of theologians who go study in Germany and come back and bring back these particular influences. But he returns from Germany, tries to get a pastorate. He's relatively unsuccessful until about 2 years later. He's in a pastorate for about 5 years or so, and then he's hired by Amherst College in 1847. But then, as you noted earlier, in 1850, he gets the call by Union Theological Seminary, and he deliberated a while over this. He wasn't sure if he should, go to teach, but he finally relents and goes to teach. And at first, he was the professor of church history, and so a number of his significant works early on are either revising massive church history works by German scholars, or writing his own. It was a history of the Church of Christ in chronological tables that he published in 1859. And this was one of his more popular works. I've been unable to see this work. It's not digitized and online. So it's there's so many, as you know, 19th century works that are digitized now, which is a great blessing, but this is one of the ones that isn't. But so he did significant work in church history. But then he, as you noted, when the chair for systematic theology was vacated by one of his colleagues at Union, then he moved over into systematic theology. And so it's, in the 19th century, it wasn't uncommon. Hodge goes from New Testament to systematics. So you would get professors shifting back and forth between various chairs and disciplines. Voss was teaching systematic theology and then shifts to biblical theology, even though his dissertation was in Old Testament. So, they did all kinds of interesting moves that these days probably wouldn't pass muster. And so then he finishes out his teaching career as a professor of systematic theology until essentially he was eventually sidelined by health issues. And then he finally died in 1877. So yeah, that's.
So was he a Presbyterian when he started teaching at Union Theological Seminary, or was he a Congregationalist at first?
Yeah, as was common with a lot of New Englanders, he was a Congregationalist, and that was part of the reason why he deliberated over whether he should go to Union, because Union was not directly connected to the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church, but it was nevertheless a Presbyterian seminary, and they wanted them to hire Presbyterian professors. And so he had to decide, do I make the move from being a Congregationalist to becoming a Presbyterian? And he did. And, it wasn't, sometimes you wonder, you see, I don't know what you want to call them, polity conversions for some people in their lives, and you wonder, were they pursuing a post, or were they really convicted that this is where I'm supposed to be? And so I think in Smith's case, he really did embrace Presbyterian life quite wholeheartedly, and he participated in the General Assembly a number of different years, and he was really instrumental in reuniting the old school and the new school after the old school, new school split earlier in the 19th century at the 1868 General Assembly. He was one of the people that, I think, in talking to Charles Hodge, persuaded Hodge, no, we can be reconciled, let's move together and be united. And I think he allayed a number of Hodge's fears that Hodge had about that particular reconciliation. So he became I don't know if you want to call it a card-carrying Presbyterian, but yeah, he did make that move when he went to Union.
So does that mean that he and Hodge would have been pretty close relationally as fellow systematic theologians? I mean,
what I've been able to find and discern is that they did a lot of interaction. I'm not sure to what degree and through what means. I suspect some of it was face-to-face. I think others of it is that I think in the old school, new school debates, Hodge was one of his sparring partners, and that they had They didn't agree, but I do believe that they had a great degree of respect for one another. And so you do see that, but I haven't yet run across, written exchanges, between them.
Right. Well, I mean, just looking at the dates, he doesn't take the systematic chair until 1855, and then like you said, the reunion is in the late 1860s. So there wouldn't have been a lot of time as systematic theology process. I don't know. I forget when Hodge's systematic theology was published or when Smith's was published.
The 1880s, I think.
Okay.
I have to double check.
Okay. Yeah. And then so Smith published a systematic theology at some point, presumably during his lifetime.
If memory serves me correctly, I think he published his systematic. Let's see here. I've got it written down. Where is it? It wasn't. I think it was published after his death. It was published posthumously, and it was published in at least the second edition in 1884. So his systematics work and his introduction to Christian theology wasn't published until after his death.
Okay, interesting. Well, so let's talk a little bit about the new school, old school debates, and why don't you just give our viewers who may not be familiar with that debate within American Presbyterianism, kind of just give a brief survey and tracing it back to Plan of Union. Go, like what's your kind of nutshell summary of that debate?
You could probably fill in some of these details better than I can, but at least in the big picture, because I always tell my students I'm big picture type of thing. There's a sense in which I say that the debates between the old school and the new school have probably been with the church since the beginning of time. It's like I remember reading about debates between ministers in France and in Geneva in the 16th century, where they said the French church is in desperate need of pastors. You need to cut their education short and send them into the pastorate right away. And then you had other people at Geneva who were saying, no, we're not taking any shortcuts. We can't cut their education short. They have to be trained the full education before they can go into the pastorate. The church is just going to have to wait. That's the kind of pattern I think that unfolds in terms of old light, new light, old side, new side, or in this particular case, old school, new school. Now, this is not to say that the old school, new school was divided upon the same particular issues as those earlier debates, but at least in terms of the discussion that we're having here, I think there's a couple of relevant points. First of all is the new school would have been very favorably disposed to New England theology, the new divinity of Jonathan Edwards. This is something that the old school was not disposed to. I mean, Charles Hodge called Jonathan Edwards a pantheist, or at least said that his theology was pantheistic. And along those lines, when John Witherspoon takes over as the president of Princeton, basically, I don't know that he ran off all the Edwardsians, but with his Scottish common sense realism, the Edwardsians realized that, their Lockean views, their Berkeleyan views were not going to mix well. And so even Jonathan Edwards Jr. decided, it's time to pull up stakes and to head out. And so there was a general mistrust, I think, among the old school theologians of any kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, maybe Enlightenment kind of philosophical influences. Now, on the flip side, some people might counter and say, well, weren't the old schoolers indebted to Scottish common sense rationalism, Scottish common sense realism, which was in and of itself an Enlightenment kind of approach, as well as indebted to Baconian kinds of understandings of science and what have you. And my personal line is that they were just realists like their forebearers were, and it just had, they were theological lambs in Enlightenment wolf's clothing. I think they were, they wanted to be conversant, so they used Baconian terms, they used Thomas Reid's terms, and they found a philosophical explanation. that was conducive to, and worked with the old theology of the 16th century. And so you also had the old schoolers who were more traditional in their theology, much more in terms of they were more serious about confessional subscription. So the new schoolers, by contrast, were more open to Enlightenment theology or Enlightenment philosophy. They were typically a little bit, I don't know, I don't want to use a pejorative term here, but they were genuinely looser on their terms of subscription, weren't as concerned with those types of things. It's like when, tell my students, when Charles Finney gets ordained as a Presbyterian, something went wrong there.
Yeah. Someone was asleep at the wheel.
Yeah, confession subscription wasn't at the top of the list of concerns. So those were the two big piece features between the two. Traditional, conservative towards the confession, suspicious of Enlightenment kind of philosophical views, contrasted with looser forms of subscription, more open to Enlightenment philosophy, and generally kind of, more open to those types of things than the traditionalists were.
Yeah. So in this article that we're going to kind of talk some about, the idea of Christian theology as a system, again, his inaugural address, in the very first paragraph, he speaks in a way that kind of gets at some of that looseness you're talking about. He speaks of the Westminster Confession of Faith, and he says, which has been here, I'm assuming Union Seminary, inculcated with a filial but not a blind devotion, not in the servility of the letter, but in the freedom of its real spirit. The Presbyterian polity has been taught, but never with a sectarian intent. So clearly, he's speaking, I'm sure, of the Princetonians, the Hodge, the old school men, with that language there.
Yeah. I think that we could add another, difference between old school, new school. The old school theologians would see the theology that they espoused as a deposit to be guarded. Whereas the new schoolers, not necessarily every one of them, but probably as a general observation, would have seen the theology that they inherited as something to be developed and to evolve. And so that's why I think that's one of the motivating factors behind their looser views of subscription. It's like Charles Briggs, who was very much way to the left of Smith, thought that the Westminster Confession's psychology was deficient, its metaphysics was deficient, that they went around hunting for proof texts after they figured out their theology. So he took a very negative view towards the Westminster Standards, whereas I think Smith was much more sympathetic towards them, but also at the same time, he was thinking, where can I push the envelope in a responsible and careful way so as to make it evolve and to improve it. Whereas I think the Princetonians would have said, there's nothing to improve. We need to guard what we have and preserve.
Yeah, that is a good, helpful summary of the two theologies. But as you've already noted, in the Northern Presbyterian Church, the two sides do come together in the late 1860s, which I've not read enough to know sort of some of the causes. You mentioned that Smith persuaded Hodge that maybe our differences aren't as big as they might appear. But I know that became a lasting sticking point between South and North, why the South did not want to unify with the North, because they had taken in so many new schoolers. And again, some of that I've not delved into, but why do you think that Hodge was willing and the other new schoolers were willing to unite with the new schoolers?
I think there are a couple of factors. I think one, the reluctance for a lot of old schoolers, at least in the South, was that they, prior to the Civil War, there's a lot of abolitionists who are Northerners and new schoolers. And so that was a factor in wanting to keep the two. But it wasn't just slavery. They were also suspicious of their commitments to New England divinity. You have somebody like Albert Barnes, who denies imputation, he denies substitutionary atonement. So there were genuine, legitimate theological concerns that they were saying that, wait a minute, we're supposed to subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, and yet you guys have turned this into a document with huge holes in it if you're allowing the likes of a Finney or an Albert Barnes type, to get through. So that's one factor. But I think that in the wake of the Civil War, the most destructive conflict in American history, I suspect that a lot of these theologians were probably wanting to try to see what ways they could bring unity to the church, to try to make some positive steps towards healing some of the divisions in the country. And so I think that that's at least one of the bigger pieces of the puzzle. And then in particular, because you get Hodge, who has concerns about all of these philosophical kind of influences in the New England divinity, that Smith was able to, persuade him that, no, it's okay. I think, you're worried, but let me allay your concerns and let me explain these things, is that we're not trying to give up the truth. We're just, using these different philosophers and ideas in a responsible way. That, I think, was one of the big unchecked, I think, assumptions, for example, or underlying causes in the Hodge-Nevin debate. I think Nevin was knee deep in Hegel. And like, for example, in D.G. Hart's book on Nevin, Hegel and his influence on Nevin just gets a passing reference or two. But I think for Hodge, that was a very significant issue. And so, So anyway, those are some of the observations.
Well, and so, you mentioned that that Briggs was, far to the left of Smith, and even reading this article, it was sort of in my head, Smith is a new schooler. I was struck by my agreement with much of what he was saying and my appreciation of what he was saying. So even here, you can see in this article, he's distancing himself from the extremes of New England theology, in particular a view of sin, on sin and imputation. And there's clearly a Christ-centered focus on redemption, a focus on incarnation, a focus on the gospel, Christ being the center, the mediatory principle of Christian religion, being the center of unity, he says. And so I'm sure that resonated with Hodge, I would think, as they start to come back together. So as you read this article and you suggested this as a good one for us to speak about, what is it about this article that makes it significant in your mind? Why is this an article that you said, hey, let's discuss this one?
Yeah, a couple of things. Let me start off with some big picture, observations. Is that in the history of theology, we'll fast forward to the 16th century to save on length. Because I don't want to nerd out too badly. But in terms of the 16th century, theologians were indebted to two types of principles. First, they have the locus approach to theology. So you get the different loci of systematic theology, or of theology, I should say, at this point. And this comes from, the ancient Stoic rhetoricians and philosophers, Seneca and Cicero and others, that you organize a subject by the various topics within it, but there's not necessarily going to be a cohesive, singular point to the organization of these things. And so you see this in Calvin's Institutes, that he just works in a sense chronologically, and he begins with our knowledge of God, creation, and then moves his way and ends up all his way into the doctrine of the church and sacraments. And this is just kind of a chronological medieval pattern that you begin with God and you end with last things, and it kind of unfolds that way because more or less that's how the scriptures begin and how the scriptures end. Well, with the onset of the Enlightenment, second observation is that the 16th century reformers were eclectic. Eclecticism was a specific philosophical commitment to saying that they didn't want to have any one particular philosophical bent to their ideas because they didn't want to give any one idea hegemony in their understanding of doctrine. And eclecticism allowed them to essentially take the best of various systems. So were they largely Aristotelian? Yes, but on the other hand, they could have Platonic accents here and there, and they could have other insights from other philosophers that could inform things. So they were very eclectic, so that if Aristotle looked at the theology of the 16th and 17th century, which is supposedly Aristotelian, he'd be like, I have no idea what this is. This is not at all what I have taught. You know, so that's why you want to be careful to say that it's a Christianized Aristotelian understanding of things. But with the Enlightenment, you get Immanuel Kant, for example, who, when he's defining the nature of a system, he says a system, and I want to underscore that. That's the first time that you get this idea of the use of system in this particular fashion. You don't even, I always wince when I apply systematic theology to theology prior to the 18th century, really, because the Reformers never called it that. It's only in the 17th century when you get them calling it a body of divinity or a system, but not in the same sense in the Kantian sense. In the Kantian sense, a system has a singular principle from which it organizes the whole thing. And it's the one principle from which you deduce the whole thing. It's an a priori that Kant talks about in his philosophical writings. And it's this idea that gets picked up in the late 18th and 19th century that just goes all over the place, so that theologians, you get B.B. Warfield saying, I think incorrectly, I don't like disagreeing with the great lion of Princeton, so I say this with fear and trembling, but it's, you know, it's where angels and monkeys fear to tread, right?
That's right.
But he says that the architectonic principle of the Westminster Confession of Faith is the covenants. I want to say, no, it's not. I don't think so. That's not the principle from which they derive the whole. Voss, for example, says that Calvin's central principle is the Trinity. I don't think that that's the case at all. But you get 19th century historians like Philip Schaff. He says, one ought to have a central idea which dominates the several parts and sheds light upon everything else therein. So you get Isaac Dorner, German theologian, who says it's Christology. Emmanuel Gerhardt, German Reformed 19th century Reformed theologian in the U.S., Christology. Henry Boynton Smith, Christology. So now the big question is Henry Boynton Smith Christocentric in the way that these other theologians are? And then I even like to challenge my students to say, why are you looking for a center?
Mm-hmm.
Whoever said there was a center? And why would we say that Calvin is theocentric and not Christocentric? You know, why are you using the whole idea of a center? That's a very kind of Enlightenment kind of approach to all of this. And so even now, ever since I started reading this thing, I don't even like to say I'm Christocentric because it sends, bad shivers up my spine. Long story short, I think we can say that there are two types of Christocentrism. There's the type of Christocentric theologian, like an Emmanuel Gerhardt, for example, or an Isaac Dorner, where they will say, yes, Christology is the one point, the one doctrine from which we get everything. Philip Schaff is that way. Charles Briggs is that way. Karl Barth, a century later, is that way. And that's why I want to say that in looking at the 19th century, Barth is passé. I mean, he really is just, I want to say this is getting long in the tooth. I don't understand why he gets all the credit for supposedly this amazing insight when it was in the theological stream for 100 years prior to Barth or more. Now, by way of contrast, what I would say is that Henry Boynton Smith is Christocentric, but not in the same way as these others are. And in this essay, he does say that he wants to use, and this is on pages 125 and 20, or 126, 127, where he says that he wants to mix the old faith and the new philosophy, not for the sake of revolution, but evolution and reform is what he says. And so I want to say, okay, so he's not trying to impose new philosophy upon theology, but he does want to see what can he tease out of it. And then, so he'll talk about the importance of Christology for the overall understanding of systematic theology. But I think in this one quotation comes from page 138. And this statement, I think, distinguishes him from a Philip Schaff or a Charles Briggs or a Barth a century later. He says, when we thus claim that the central idea of the Christian system, which binds its parts together in a living unity, is to be found only in Christ, we do not, of course, mean that this is a principle in the sense that the rest of the system is to be logically deduced from it, as when in mathematics from the definition of a circle all deductions about it are derived, nor yet that in the order of time Christ precedes all, but simply that the mediatorial principle is the center of unity to the system, to speak with Nietzsche, who is a German theologian, not Nietzsche, its middle term. So here, if I could rephrase what he's saying, is I think he's simply saying that Christology is the one doctrine that we want to have all the other doctrines to coordinate, or to ask, in what way is this connected to Christology? So he's not Christocentric in the Barthian sense, to use that anachronistically. That's the way I think some of these 19th century theologians, Emmanuel Gerhardt, for example, calling Christology the real Prinzip, which is a German term for this central idea, the central dogma, if you will. Now, here's where I would critique Henry Boynton Smith, to say that I think that that's what the 16th century theologians were doing, the 17th century theologians were doing, at least the good ones, is that I always tell my students, good systematic theology doesn't treat the loci as silos where the other silos never touch each other, but rather they're always relating the various loci to all of the other loci in their best moments. And one of the best ways that I can illustrate that is if you look at, chapter 8 in the Westminster Confession of Faith on Christology, Charles Briggs, for example, criticized the Westminster Confession for having a deficient pneumatology. Yet when you read chapter 8 of the Confession, there is almost as much pneumatology in that chapter as there is Christology. And what nowadays Roman Catholic theologians will call, the pneumatological Christology. I'm like, yeah, that's old hat, man. You go back to Westminster Confession, chapter 8, and it arguably goes even further back into the Middle Ages. That's been around for a long time.
Yeah.
So at its best, I think that the tradition was doing that. But I think what Henry Boynton Smith is doing is he's getting to that, but via kind of an Enlightenment path, without necessarily allowing the Enlightenment philosophy, the Kantian idea of a system having an organizing principle, override the rest of the system, so that Christology drowns out the rest of theology.
Do you get the sense that this quote on 138, that he is purposefully, he has those other theologians in his sights when he says this? I mean, he's not just happening to say it's not this, but this, but he's saying that specifically.
I think so. I think he's being a polite theologian, that he's not naming names, but he's distancing himself from some of these other forms of it, so that he can say, I'm not letting Christology swallow everything, because that's, I think, Barth's problem, is that Christology swallows everything. Christology is special revelation. So there's no place for a covenant of works. There's no place really for a doctrine of God. There's no place for these other doctrines because Christology has swallowed all of the other doctrines like Jonah. It's just taken them all. Whereas if you read his systematic theology and his doctrine of God, it's not that Christological as he gives the impression that he would want it to be. So in that sense, I think that he's got some helpful insights here and some good questions to say, to tease our minds to think, or to not tease our minds, but to motivate or to prick our consciences and our minds to say, in what way should we relate theology proper to Christology? In what way do we want to relate revelation to Christology, and ask those questions to say, how do the other loci of systematic theology organically relate to Christology? Personally, I think he states it at times a little incautiously, so that he gives the impression that he's a lot like these other theologians. But like you said, on this quote from 138, I think he's purposefully trying to distance himself. There's a great essay, and you can probably get it through the Journal Article Services, JSTOR or EBSCO, I think, or maybe ATLA, written by Richard Muller on Henry Boynton Smith, where he talks about these things in great detail, and he kind of distinguishes Boynton Smith from some of these other so-called Christocentric theologians. That's
interesting. Well, so let's move just briefly to he speaks of the on page 149. He talks about the doctrinal disputes that were currently at hand, and he traces them back to the so-called New England theology coming into the Presbyterian churches through the plan of union, and it seems as, again, this is one of those historical theological topics that I don't know enough about, but the little that I know, he seems to be distancing himself from the followers of Edwards, but also he's trying to find the middle ground. So like on page 164, he has this long list of, we're neither this nor this. We're not antinomians or Arminians. We're not left to the alternative of blind faith or irrational contingency. God's not the author of sin, nor does human efficiency make man the author of holiness. So as you read that latter section, the latter half of this article, where he's trying to disagree, it seems, with, I guess, the Bellamy, Hopkins, some of the post-Edwardians, kind of unpack that for us. What is he doing here?
Yeah, I think for Hodge and a lot of the old schoolers, they were definitely, had great consternation about the New England theology because of, it's not called New Divinity, for no reason. And so because of the governmental theory of the atonement, or because of the denial of imputation, or at least immediate imputation that the Princetonians were so adamant about, or I think, for example, of the funeral oration at Dabney's funeral, that when the person giving the, I think it was a Reverend Johnson, I think is his name, was giving the oration, he says that Dabney cuts up Edwardsianism by the roots. It was just, I don't think, it's so strange today, because I tell my students, the bad guys of today can become heroes in the next century, and the heroes in the one century can become villains in the next. You never know what church history is going to do with various figures. And so in this sense, in the wake of Edward's death, and in the 18th and the 19th century, he had a very mixed reception. Nowadays he's got a very positive reception. Edwards is my homeboy t-shirts, and John Piper's all over Edwards and loves Edwards. But when I lecture on Edwards, I bring out some of the, I don't know what else to call it, but just the theological weirdness in Edwards. the fact that he denied the physical existence of the world, that it was all an idea in God's mind, that he was an immaterialist. These were great concerns for Hodge. And so, like, you pointed out on page 149, when he says, our doctrinal disputes may be traced back to the influence of the so-called New England theology. Next paragraph, in the theology of the elder Edwards, many find the seeds and summary of the strife. So the fact that he was willing to name names and to say, yeah, Edwards is one of the source of our problems, and then take the line that he does at the end of the essay where he's saying we're not these things, I think it's perhaps those particular tones and those particular, explanations that in the long term gave Hodge some, consolation to know, okay, he's not an advocate, and these men aren't advocates of kind of this wild, new divinity. They're closer to us than we realize. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it was Smith through that way that was able to bring about the pieces of the puzzle, to bring about the reunion between the old school and the new school. Yeah. So in that sense, yes, Henry Boynton Smith was to the left of Hodge, but on the other hand, I don't know where he sits. Maybe right near the center, maybe slightly left of center, depending on who you ask. I don't know. But left of Hodge, but at least Hodge was comfortable enough with him to say, okay, let's bring the two sides together again. Yeah. As to how successful that was, I'll leave that up to other people to decide.
So one of the things that's puzzled me about this old school, new school debate over the new divinity is that some of the topics that they were discussing and debating seem to be topics that we just don't talk about today. Whether it's, the nature of virtue, or whether it's imputation of sin, and they're heavily philosophical. They are, talking about original sin, talking about the will. Why do you think that these theological topics they just seem not relevant to us today? Would you agree that they are irrelevant, that they're not important, or have we just sort of missed the boat? Like, how have you sort of thought through that?
Yeah, no, I think that they're still very relevant. Because of various circumstances in my ministry, it's been probably more than a decade or so since I've ever asked a theological question of a ministerial candidate, either because I was the moderator, or because I was on the credentials committee, or because I knew the student, so I felt like I should, sit back. But some of the questions that I would like to ask is talk to me about the faculty psychology and the doctrine of anthropology. And I have a feeling that a lot of students would blank on that. Talk to me about the metaphysics of creation ex nihilo. And I don't think that they would be comfortable or understand a lot of these things. And these were a lot of topics and ideas that, like you said, these 19th century theologians were all over, and they talked about it. And as to why this kind of detailed discussion drops off and drops away is, I think it's because of the influence of logical positivism in the 20th century, the late 19th century, the idea that we have to purge theology of all metaphysics, and we have to get rid of all philosophy, and we just need to talk about the biblical text. And so it's the purging of metaphysics, the influence of logical positivism, that basically it's almost kind of an empiricism. Only what we can see in the text, that's what really matters. And then in addition to that, the rise of biblicism in the 20th century, so that you do get some odd folks like John Murray, for example. Maybe that's not the best combination of words to put odd folks and John Murray in the same sentence, but he's unique in the sense that he's very much a biblicist in his theology. You look at the collected writings on systematic theology, they're very untechnical. And people might say, well, his lectures were different. And I'm like, well, I don't think so. I've read some of his lectures, and his lectures read a lot like that very untechnical stuff. Whereas if you compare Dabney, Thornwell, Smith, it's very philosophically adorned. So now Murray still can talk about immediate imputation, for example, and so he will talk about some of these things. But I think it's because of the rise of biblicism and the influence of trying to purge theology, and it was very popular also in science, to purge science of metaphysics and philosophy. But it's like I tell my students, he who says that he has no philosophy is probably the slave of a defunct philosopher or theologian. He just doesn't know it. I think that's probably why it's happened. And the way that I've described it in other settings is that one of the reasons why we're having so many problems, say, on the doctrine of God and aseity, or the doctrine of Christ, and not understanding the nature of the hypostatic union, is because we've lost the theological and philosophical grammar of the earlier church that we had up until about the 17th or 18th century. We've lost that grammar, and so we no longer understand it. And because we don't understand it or use it, we are denying, at least in the broader church, the doctrine of God's aseity, or his immutability, or his impassibility. We don't understand the implications of a Chalcedonian Christology of being fully man and fully God, and what it means that they're not confused, mixed, and that these are two distinct natures in one person. We basically lost that grammar. The degree to which these 19th century theologians were conversant with that grammar is going to depend upon who we're talking about.
Right, but it highlights the importance of reading the 19th century American Presbyterians, of knowing them, and so that's obviously one of the goals of Law College Press. And so let me just ask you one more question before we wrap up. Talk to us just briefly about the importance of primary sources, how you encourage your students to read primary sources, and let's just kind of end with that.
Yeah, when I teach my church history courses, I only give church history books as recommended reading. I say, if you want some supplementary information to what I'm giving you in the lectures, here are some books that you can look at. And I always assign primary sources. And I tell them, I don't want you so much to read books about what Calvin said. I want you to read what Calvin said. And so I think that reading, to talk colloquially, to get it straight from the horse's mouth is so important these days. It's like today I was listening to an interview with Marilyn Robinson, who's a self-professed Calvinist. She's a novelist and the author of Gilead, a Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, and other books and other essays. And she says that so many of the people that she runs into, when they find out she's a Calvinist, they object. And she says, well, why do you object? And then they rattle off these, various reasons. Oh, he was stern. He wasn't filled with joy. He, was a determinist. And then she asks the next question, which is, well, have you read him? Well, no. I haven't read him. She says so many people are critical of Calvin and they've never read him.
Yeah.
And so I want my students to read firsthand, what these people say. Because often it's the case that what the history books say about these people isn't necessarily as accurate as we might think. And so nowadays, I'm huge about being very careful about the technology that we use. That being said, we live in such an amazing time right now because we have such access to so many primary sources that as little as 15 years ago, we did not have access to them. You would have to go to special collections, to libraries. I once had to send the daughter of a colleague into the special collections archives at Duke University to take a picture of a letter for me, and then send it to me. Nowadays, you can, it's like you said, you have in excess of 5,000 works.
Yeah, 5,000 works. Yeah, it's amazing. Law College Press website could not exist, like you said, 15 years ago.
I mean, it's just amazing. So now more than any other time before in the history of the world, we have almost unfettered access to all of the primary sources that we could ever want or ask. So that's why I love studying 19th century history and theology, because they mention a book, let me Google that, and then just tag archive at the end of the search, and it shows up typically in archive.org or Google Books. Download it, put it on your iPad, read it, mark it up. You just have access to everything. So now I tell my students, this has really upped the ante for church history and historical theology, because now we have no excuse, or little to no excuse, for not being able to get access to all of these primary sources.
Yeah.
So it's great. A tremendous, tremendous blessing. And to me, maybe I'm a huge nerd, or at least a nerd that's 5'9", which isn't so huge, but it's so much fun. I mean, it's so much fun, and it's so interesting.
Well, I imagine anyone listening to this conversation is like us, also kind of history nerds, and so they'll appreciate that. So, well, John, thank you so much. It's been great to learn about Smith and about the 19th century, the old school, new school, and the Edwardsian debates to a degree. And so, thank you for joining us. And
thanks for having
me.
We do
encourage you to, you're welcome. And again, if you want to check out one of John's books, The Spirit of the Age, on that 19th century debate over the Holy Spirit. One of our newest books we've come out with, Presbyterianism by Samuel Miller. You can find that on our website. We're actually about to come out in the next month or so, Impeccable by William Plummer, on the impeccability of Jesus Christ. I'm really excited about that one getting published here in a little bit. So we'll let the word out whenever that's available. Well, y'all have a great day, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.